That's the shooter from the ambush. Sergeant Nash froze, hand still pressed against a stranger's throat, checking for a pulse that shouldn't have been there at all. Because 3 days ago, this same face lit up orange through rifle smoke on a ridge with no business having anyone on it, save 6 lives, and vanished before anyone could say thank you. Now she was drowning in the flood, about to swallow an entire county whole. Get her breathing, Vance ordered. Now, they pulled her from the river half dead, found a bullet wound she'd stitched herself, days old, professional, cold. When the fingerprints came back, one name detonated across a captain's radio like a second explosion. Calloway, daughter of a woman buried 7 years ago in an empty casket nobody was allowed to open. Except the dead don't send warnings from beyond the grave, and somebody wanted her silence before she remembered why. Rain had been falling over Larkspur Hollow for 6 straight days by the time anyone outside the county thought to worry about it, and even then the worry arrived. The way worry usually arrived for places like this one: late, distracted, filtered through 100 other headlines before it finally landed. Nobody in Washington was watching Miller's Fork Dam. Nobody in the state capital had put it on a briefing sheet. It was just a town, small and stubborn and proud in the particular quiet way of towns that had survived worse and expected to survive this too, right up until the exact moment it became clear that expectation and survival were not, in fact, the same thing. Front porches sat dark up and down the county roads, generators running where they could, candles burning where they couldn't, and everywhere the same low murmur of radios repeating the same advisory, over and over, into rooms that had already started to flood around the ankles of the people, still refusing to leave them. The water came up slow, then it came up fast. That was the thing about Miller's Fork that nobody in Larkspur Hollow ever wanted to say out loud, not even the old-timers who remembered the last flood, not even the ones who swore they'd never build this close to the bank again, and then built anyway. Slow, then fast, like a held breath finally let go. Captain Odessa Vance stood on the ridge above the county road with rain needling sideways into her collar and watched the brown water eat a mailbox whole. Just swallowed it. 1 second, a little tin box on a post, red flag up like somebody was expecting good news, and the next second nothing. Gone under. She didn't blink. She'd learned a long time ago that blinking didn't stop anything from happening. It just meant you missed watching it happen, and Vance preferred to watch. Behind her, the guard trucks idled in a crooked line, headlights cutting cones through the downpour, and her people moved through those cones like ghosts doing chores. Sandbags, ropes, a stretcher nobody had used yet, but everybody kept checking anyway, because checking was better than standing still. Captain. Sergeant Priya Nash came up beside her, poncho slick, voice pitched to cut through the rain without shouting. Miller's Fork Dam. Spillways compromised. Engineers are saying it's not going to hold past midnight. They said that yesterday. They're saying it different today. Vance turned her head. Just her head. Rain ran off the brim of her cap in a thin curtain. Different how? Different like they stopped hedging. That was the phrase that did it. Vance had spent 11 years learning to hear the difference between an engineer covering himself and an engineer who was scared and stopped hedging was the second kind. She looked back down at the water eating the mailbox's shadow, at the place where a fence line used to be, at the roof line of the Hutchins place poking up out of the flood like a knuckle. Behind her, in the bed of the nearest truck, someone had left a battery-powered radio running low, a county AM station cycling the same flood advisory on a loop, a man's voice gone flat with repetition telling residents of Larkspur Hollow to seek higher ground immediately, to avoid the low road, to expect the situation to worsen before it improved. Vance had heard the loop 11 times since sundown. She could recite it now without trying. That was the strange arithmetic of disaster work she'd learned. The information didn't change, only the ground under it did. Get everyone off the low road, she said now. Not in 20 minutes. Nash didn't answer with words. She turned and ran, poncho snapping, and Vance watched her go and thought, not for the first time this week, that she had built her career on trusting people who ran instead of people who talked, and that the world kept giving her more reasons to keep doing that. 15 years in the Guard had taught Vance a great deal about the difference between the disasters people expected and the ones that actually arrived. Everybody braced for the storm. Nobody braced for the 18 months of quiet decisions that came before it. The budget line skipped, the inspection deferred, the memo nobody read past the first paragraph, all of it accumulating in the dark, the same patient way the river accumulated. Until one gray Tuesday, the accumulation simply became visible, and everyone acted surprised. She had stopped being surprised a long time ago. It was, she sometimes thought, the only real qualification the job required. She thought of her own mother then, briefly, unbidden, the way memory did in the cold and the dark when a person's guard slipped even half an inch. Her mother had been a nurse, small town, unglamorous, the kind of woman who drove 40 minutes each way through worse weather than this, for a job that never once made the news. She had taught Vance, without ever once sitting her down to say so directly, that the measure of a person wasn't what they did when everyone was watching. It was what they did at 3 in the morning, in the rain, when nobody was ever going to know either way. Vance had built her whole career trying to live up to a standard her mother had never once described out loud, and some nights, standing on ridges just like this one, she still felt the old ache of wanting her mother to see this, to see the woman all that quiet example had built. She didn't have time for the ache tonight. She folded it the way she folded most things lately and went back to the water. She keyed her radio. All units, this is Vance. Miller's Fork spillway integrity is compromised. We are pulling back from the low road effective now. Repeat, effective now. Static. Then Colton Briggs's voice, young and a half step too eager, the way it always was when things went sideways. Captain, we've still got 2 families on Route 9 we haven't reached. Then reach them faster and pull back at the same time. Specialist. Those aren't different jobs tonight. Copy that. She let the radio hang from her hand and looked out at the water one more time. Because that was the job, wasn't it? Not the sandbags, not the ropes. The job was standing on high ground in the rain and deciding in the space of about 4 seconds who got saved first and who got saved second and who might not get saved at all if the numbers ran the way the numbers sometimes ran. Nobody put that part in the recruitment posters. She thought, unbidden, of 3 nights ago. She hadn't meant to. It just came up out of the dark the way things did when you were tired and cold and standing very still, the memory rising the same way the river was rising now, slow and then all at once. 3 nights before the flood, on a stretch of logging road, nobody official had bothered to name. Vance's convoy had run into an ambush that shouldn't have existed. That was the part that still didn't sit right in her chest. In her chest, when she let herself think about it. Not that it happened, ambushes. What didn't sit right was that nobody had known it was coming. Not intelligence, not local law enforcement, not the 2 contractors from the relief company who'd been riding along and who'd gone very quiet and very pale the second the first shots cracked out of the tree line. 3 vehicles, 6 of her people, and gunfire coming from a ridge that had no business having anyone on it because that ridge belonged to nobody. No property line, no logging permit, nothing but pine and rock, and now, apparently, men with rifles who knew exactly where the convoy would be and exactly when. Vance remembered the truck in front of her swerving, tires screaming on wet gravel, remembered Briggs's voice cracking over the radio, calling out positions that didn't help, because there weren't any good positions, remembered thinking with a strange, cold clarity, we are going to lose people tonight, and I am not going to be able to stop it. And then the tree line had lit up, not with more gunfire aimed at them, with gunfire aimed away from them, into the ridge, precise and unhurried, 3 shots and then silence and then 2 more, the kind of shooting that didn't waste itself, the kind of shooting that came from someone who had done this so many times. The fear had worn all the way through and left something underneath that was almost peaceful. Whoever it was had pinned the ambushes from a position Vance's team never found. Not that night, and not the 2 nights after when Briggs went back with a metal detector out of sheer stubbornness. Just gone. Like whoever fired those shots had stepped out of the tree line, done the work, and stepped back into it, like closing a door. Briggs had walked that ridge for 6 hours total, across 2 separate days, sweeping a grid pattern he'd drawn himself on a paper map because the terrain was too broken for the vehicles to follow. He found brass. 3 casings, matched to a caliber. None of the ambushers had been carrying, tucked into a shallow scrape behind a fallen log at a firing angle that made sense only if you understood exactly how far the shooter had been willing to let the danger get before answering it. He found a single boot print in soft clay near a drainage cut, small, a woman's size, the tread pattern worn on the outer edge in a way that spoke of somebody who favored their left leg going downhill. And he found, half buried under wet leaves 20 yards further on, a torn strip of gauze, bloodied, already gone stiff with age by the time he uncovered it. He'd bagged the gauze, without really understanding what he was looking at. It wasn't until 3 nights later, standing over Nash's shoulder in the medical tent, while she peeled back the improvised bandage, on a half-drowned stranger's side, that the shape of it clicked into place for him all at once, cold and sudden, like a held door swinging shut. He hadn't said anything then. He'd just gone very quiet, the way young soldiers do when the world stops behaving, the way their training manuals promised it would, and gone to find Vance instead, because some things needed to be said to a captain before they were said to anyone else. They never saw a face. That was the part Nash kept circling back to in the hours after, while she was stitching up Briggs's forearm where a round had grazed him. "We didn't even see a face, Captain. Just," and she'd made a gesture with her hands, something quick and economical, like she was trying to describe a shape made of nothing but motion. Vance had filed it as unexplained, had told herself that was the responsible thing to do, filing it, moving on, because there was a flood coming, and floods didn't wait around for you to solve your mysteries first. She hadn't expected the mystery to come find her, which was, in its way, exactly what happened. Nash's voice cracked over the radio 40 minutes later, and it wasn't the calm dispatcher cadence she usually kept even when things were bad. It was higher, faster, the kind of voice that skipped the training and went straight to the human underneath it. "Captain, I need you at the bend by the old grain elevator. Right now. I need you right now." Vance was already moving before she keyed the radio to answer. "Talk to me, Sergeant. There's someone in the water. A person. I've got a person in the water and I don't..." A pause, breath, the sound of boots slipping on wet ground. "I don't think this is a flood victim, Captain. I think..." "Just get here." She didn't wait for the rest. She ran. The grain elevator stood up out of the flood plain, like the rib cage of something dead, gray concrete gone black with rain, and the water around its base moved in slow brown coils that carried branches and shingles and once, horribly, a child's bicycle spinning end over end before it went under and didn't come back up. Vance came around the bend at a dead run, with 2 of her people behind her, and found Nash on her knees at the water's edge, both arms out, fighting the current for a grip on something that kept trying to slide away from her. "Help me," Nash said, and there was nothing performed in it at all. Vance went in up to her thighs without thinking about it, the cold hitting her like a hand, slammed flat against her sternum, and got an arm under the shape in the water, and pulled. A woman, small, smaller than the water made her look, the way drowning always made people look larger, and then smaller again once you had them out of it, like the river borrowed size and gave it back reluctantly. Dark hair plastered flat to a pale face, lips gone the color of the sky. No pulse Vance could find at first, and then, one, thin and fast and there, and she felt something loosen in her own chest that she didn't examine too closely at the time. "She's breathing," Nash said, hands already moving, already doing the things her training told her to do, checking airway, checking for obvious trauma, working with the brisk, terrified efficiency of someone who has been taught exactly what panic is allowed to look like. "Barely. She's breathing, Captain. Get the stretcher." "Get it now." They got her onto the stretcher, got her up the bank, got her under the tarp they'd rigged as a triage station 40 yards from where the water still crept forward, inch by patient inch, like it hadn't decided yet whether it was done with this town or not. And it was Nash, wiping rain and river water off the woman's face with the side of her hand, who went still. Not the trained stillness of triage, a different kind. The kind that comes over a person right before the ground under their understanding of a situation gives way. Captain. Nash's voice had dropped to almost nothing. Captain, look at her face. Vance looked, really looked, the way she hadn't let herself look yet, too busy with pulse and pressure, and the mechanics of not letting a person die in front of her. And the floor of her stomach fell out from under her, the way it does when your mind gets somewhere half a second before your mouth does. Because she knew this face. She had seen it for maybe 4 seconds 3 nights ago. Lit orange by muzzle flash on a ridge that shouldn't have had anyone on it, before it turned and vanished back into the tree line, like it had never been there at all. That's her, Nash said, and her hand had gone still against the unconscious woman's cheek. That's the shooter from the ambush. Captain, that's her. Vance didn't answer right away. She crouched there in the rain, with her boots full of river water, and looked down at the small, pale, unconscious face of the woman who had, 3 nights ago, saved every single life in her convoy, and then disappeared like smoke, and who had now washed up half-drowned at the edge of a flood that was still rising, and she thought, Larkspur Hollow does not do this. Ordinary towns do not do this. Get her breathing steadier, she said out loud, because that was the part of her job she knew how to do even when the rest of the world had stopped making sense. Get her warm. And Nash, Captain, when she wakes up, I want to be standing right here. They got her stable in the field tent an hour later, the storm still hammering the canvas overhead in long percussive sheets, and it was there, cutting away the soaked jacket to check for injury, that Nash found the second thing that didn't fit. She'd gone quiet again. Vance noticed it before she understood it, the particular quality of silence that settled over a trained medic who had just found something she didn't expect and was taking a second to be sure before she said it out loud. Captain. Nash's fingers had stopped moving over the woman's side, just above the hip, where a strip of improvised bandage had been wound tight and secured with what looked like a torn strip of shirt fabric, days old, dark with old blood underneath. This isn't flood trauma. Say that plainer. Nash peeled the fabric back with careful fingers, and underneath it was a wound that even Vance, no medic, recognized on sight. Entry point clean. Exit point ragged, the tissue around it inflamed in the particular way of something that had happened before the water, not because of it. She's been shot, Nash said. 3, maybe 4 days ago. She dressed this herself, Captain. Look at the stitching. That's not ER work. That's field work. That's someone who's done this to herself before and didn't flinch doing it. Vance stood very still, rain drumming overhead, and let that arrange itself into a shape in her mind. A woman who could vanish a rifle team from an ambush without being seen. A woman who then spent 3 days somewhere, unaccounted for, bleeding from a bullet wound she'd stitched herself with the calm of a professional. A woman who then somehow ended up half-drowned in a flood that had only started rising tonight. That's not a coincidence, Vance said half to herself. None of this is a coincidence. No, ma'am, Nash said. I don't think it is. Outside the tent, thunder rolled long and low across the hollow, and somewhere down the valley, the river kept climbing, patient, indifferent, like it had all the time in the world, and didn't care in the slightest what mysteries it had just delivered to Odessa Vance's doorstep. She woke like a held breath finally let go. That was how it felt from the inside, the way Wren Calloway would have described it if anyone had asked her, which nobody did, not right away. Because for the first several seconds of consciousness, nobody in the tent even knew she was awake. Her eyes opened to canvas. Gray canvas, sagging under rain, lit from below by a lantern somebody had propped near her cot. She didn't move, that was the first rule. Don't move. Don't let your breathing change. Take the 4 seconds a body gets, right at the edge of waking, when the world hasn't yet noticed you're back in it, and use them to listen. Because the last thing she remembered, the last real thing, before the water took the rest, was the crack of a rifle from somewhere she hadn't cleared, and the punch of impact low on her side, and the black water closing over her face like a hand, which meant someone had found her, which meant she needed to know who, before they knew she was awake to ask. Voices. 2 of them, low, a woman's cadence and a man's, somewhere past the canvas wall to her left. Equipment sounds. The particular rustle of a poncho being shaken out, rain on canvas, a steady percussion she used to count her own pulse against An old trick her mother had taught her before she was old enough to understand why a person would need to count their pulse against rainfall in the first place. Mama. The thought arrived and she shut it down instantly, the way she'd learned to shut down anything that threatened to slow her hands or blur her eyes at the wrong moment. Not now. Not here. Grief was a country she visited on her own schedule, in her own house, with the door locked, and this was not that. She opened her eyes the rest of the way. A woman stood at the foot of the cot, uniform soaked through, insignia she recognized, National Guard, Captain's bar's dark hair scraped back under a cap, eyes that had already found Wren's the instant they opened, because of course they had, because this was someone who also knew the 4-second rule and had been watching for it. "You're awake," the captain said, flat, not a question. Wren said nothing, ran the inventory instead, wrists free, ankles free, IV line in her left arm. That was new, that was a liability, that was something she'd need to deal with. Tent flap 15 feet to the south. A second person, the sergeant, she guessed, from the voice she'd heard standing near a folding table, with a rifle slung but not raised. Not hostile posture, not yet. "You've been out for 2 hours, the captain said. "You've got a gunshot wound, you dressed yourself, and you washed up half drowned in a flood that's still rising. I've got a lot of questions, and you're going to want to answer at least some of them, because right now you're the only lead I've got on something that shot up my convoy 3 nights ago." "Hook?" Wren's eyes flicked just once toward the tent flap, calculating distance, calculating the IV line, how fast she could pull it, how much noise it would make. The captain saw her do it. "Don't," she said, not unkindly, but with a weight behind it that made Wren stop calculating for half a second and actually look at her. "You're in no shape to run, and I don't have the manpower to chase you through a flood tonight. So, let's not waste either of our time." "I want to leave," Wren said. Her voice came out rougher than she meant it to, sand and river water still in it. "I know you do. That wasn't a request. I know that too." The captain crossed her arms, rain still dripping off the brim of her cap in a slow, steady rhythm. "You saved 6 of my people 3 nights ago. You didn't stick around to be thanked. I've got questions about that, and about the bullet in your side, and about why a woman who moves like a professional is doing all of this alone, in the middle of a county that's about to lose a dam. You don't have to answer any of it tonight. But you're not walking out of this tent in the next hour, because you'll fall down before you clear the tree line, and then I'll just be fishing you out of the mud instead of the river." Wren held the woman's gaze for a long moment. There was something in it. She recognized, not softness, not exactly, but the particular kind of steadiness that came from a person who had made a lot of hard calls fast and lived with all of them. "Fine," Wren said. "I'll stay until I can walk." "That's not the same as answering questions." "No," Wren agreed. "It isn't." The captain almost smiled at that. "Almost. I'm Captain Odessa Vance. This is Sergeant Nash." Wren said nothing, just closed her eyes again. Not to sleep, but because the ceiling of the tent had started to swim a little at the edges, and she needed a second to make it stop, and she was not going to let either of these two see that happen. She closed her eyes again after the captain left, and this time sleep did come, thin and unreliable, the kind that didn't so much rest her as drag her sideways into memory instead. She was 22 years old in the memory, not younger, because her mother had made sure of that, had waited until Wren was well past the age where a person could be called a child by any fair accounting, before she'd handed over the parts of herself that could not be unlearned once they were given. They were standing on a stretch of rangeland, 2 states from anywhere, wind combing flat through knee-high grass, and her mother's voice was doing the thing it always did in that particular, clipped cadence she used only for teaching, never for anything else. Not for comfort, not for arguments, only for this. "Breath is a metronome," Margot Calloway said, crouched beside her daughter in the grass, close enough that Wren could smell coffee and gun oil and the particular soap her mother had used for as long as Wren could remember. Not a suggestion, a metronome. You don't fight it, you use it. "I know, Mama. You know it in your head. Your hands don't know it yet. That's the gap that gets people killed, baby. Not the not knowing. The gap between the knowing and the doing." Her mother's hand came to rest, light, precise, on the back of Wren's neck, guiding without forcing. Again, they did it again. and again after that, until the light went long and orange across the grass, and Wren's shoulder had gone numb from the stock of the rifle, and her mother's voice had never once risen, never once sharpened into the frustration Wren kept braced for and never received. "Why are you teaching me this?" Wren had asked once, that same golden evening, lowering the rifle, looking sideways at the woman who was, in every official document Wren had ever been shown, simply an analyst, simply a desk job, simply somebody who flew to conferences and came home tired and never once, not once in Wren's whole childhood, explained where the calluses on her hands had come from. Her mother had been quiet for a long moment, looking out at the grass, moving in the wind like something breathing. "Because the world doesn't ask permission before it decides what it's going to need from you," Margot said finally. "And I would rather hand you the tools myself, on my own schedule, in my own voice, than have the world hand them to you some night when I'm not there to soften the lesson." She'd turned, then, and looked directly at her daughter with an expression. Wren had spent 7 years since trying to name precisely, and had never quite managed. "I need you to be able to survive things I can't always be standing next to you for." "That's not fear-talking, Wren. That's love, doing the only honest thing love knows how to do." She hadn't understood it then. Not really. She'd nodded, the way a 22-year-old nods at a truth too large to hold all at once, and gone back to her stance, and let the lesson continue. She understood it now, lying on a cot in a flood tent 5 years and 1 empty casket later, with a bullet wound stitched by her own hands and a captain outside who had just said the word classified like it was an ordinary Tuesday word. Wren understood her mother's lesson with a clarity that felt less like comprehension and more like grief arriving late to a room it had always been owed entry to. "You knew," she thought, eyes still shut, breath still even, the old metronome discipline holding even now, even here. "You knew something was coming for you eventually. And instead of running from it, you spent your last good years making sure I'd survive whatever it left behind." She didn't cry. She had trained that reflex down to almost nothing a long time ago, the same way she'd trained her hands to hold a rifle steady through fear, and there was a part of her, a small tired, honest part that wondered sometimes whether that had been the wrong lesson to learn quite so well. She didn't offer her name. Not that first night. Vance let it go, because there were bigger fires to put out literally. In one case, a transformer down 2 streets overthrowing sparks into standing water until Briggs's team got the power cut, and because pushing too hard too fast on a wounded stranger who'd already proven she could vanish a team of armed men from a hillside seemed like a strategically poor use of anyone's energy. But Nash stayed, sat on an overturned crate near the cot with a tablet in her lap, ostensibly monitoring vitals, actually watching the woman's face in the lantern light with the particular attention of someone piecing together a puzzle she hadn't been given all the edges to. "You've got training," Nash said, mostly to fill the silence, mostly because silence in a flood tent at 2 in the morning had a way of getting inside a person's skull and rattling around. "Combat medic, or close to it." That field dressing wasn't luck. Wren didn't open her eyes. "You've got training too. Army. 6 years. You? Nothing." Nash tried a different door. "You've got a scar on your left forearm that's older than the gunshot. Looks like a knife wound. Defensive from the angle." A pause. "You've done this before." Not the flood, the running. Wren's eyes opened, slow, and fixed on the canvas ceiling instead of on Nash. Nash was starting to understand. This woman's version of eye contact when she didn't want to give anything away. "Everybody's done something before," Wren said. "Not everybody dresses a gunshot wound like they've read a field manual cover to cover and then memorized it out of spite." That got something. Not a smile. A flicker. Quick. Gone before it fully arrived. Somewhere around the corner of Wren's mouth. "You talk a lot for someone on watch duty. You don't talk enough for someone who just got fished out of a river with a bullet in her. I'm working on a schedule. Care to share the schedule?" "No, fine. New question. You cold?" "No, you're shivering. It's exactly the same thing. Not where I'm from. And where's that?" Silence. "See," Nash said. "That's what I mean about the schedule." Wren's mouth did the thing again. The almost smile, quick and gone. "You're not going to give up, are you? 6 years Army medic. I've sat with worse company than you and gotten more out of them. Is that a threat or a compliment? Depends how the next hour goes. Wren turned her head then, finally, and actually looked at Nash, for the first time since the conversation started, something assessing in it, something that felt less like suspicion and more like a person checking, carefully, whether a door was actually safe to open even a crack. You held my pulse in the water for 4 minutes before anyone else even got there. I heard it in your voice on the radio. You didn't sound like someone doing a job. You sounded like someone who'd decided already. I wasn't allowed to die. Nash didn't look away from that. I don't like losing people I haven't even met yet. Feels unfair to them. That's not how triage works. No, Nash agreed. It's how I work. Nash huffed something that was almost a laugh, tired and a little disbelieving, and let the silence come back in. Outside, the storm had settled into a long, grinding rhythm, less violent than before but relentless. The kind of rain that didn't announce disaster so much as accumulated, minute by minute, until the disaster was simply there one morning, like it had always been coming. It was nearly an hour later, when Nash had drifted into the particular alert doze of someone who has learned to sleep, sitting up with one ear still working, that Wren spoke again, quiet, almost to herself, almost like she'd forgotten anyone else could hear. Is everyone from the convoy all right? Nash's eyes opened fully. You mean the ambush? I mean everyone. Everyone's alive, Nash said carefully. Briggs took a graze, nothing that needed more than stitches, a beat. Because of you. Wren's jaw worked once, a small motion, and then went still. Good, she said, and there was something underneath the single word that Nash couldn't name yet but would think about for days afterward. Relief. Yes, but braided through with something heavier. Something that sounded, if Nash let herself listen for it, almost like penance. Why'd you run? Nash asked. After the ambush. You had 6 of us standing right there. We'd have gotten you medical attention on the spot, instead of you doing field surgery on yourself in a ditch somewhere. Wren was quiet, long enough that Nash thought she wasn't going to answer at all. Because staying gets people killed, Wren said finally. Not the people you're trying to protect. The people who protect them. Every time. It's a pattern. I've watched it happen enough times to stop arguing with it. That's not an answer. That's a wall. It's the only kind of answer I've got tonight, Sergeant. Nash let it sit. She had interviewed enough scared, wounded, evasive people over 6 years of service to know the difference between someone hiding something shameful and someone hiding something that had already cost them everything once and was terrified of it costing them everything again. This felt like the second kind. She filed that away too. Next, to the scar and the field dressing and the 4-second stillness at the moment of waking, all of it accumulating the way the floodwater was accumulating outside. Slow, and then, she suspected, not slow at all. Dawn came up gray and reluctant over Larkspur Hollow, the kind of light that didn't so much rise as get dragged into place, and it found Captain Vance standing outside the triage tent with a cup of coffee gone cold in her hand, and Specialist Colton Briggs jogging up the muddy slope toward her with his tablet held out like an offering. Captain, got something back on the prints. Vance had run the woman's prints through the county system almost as an afterthought, more procedure than expectation. The kind of box Yox checked because checking it was faster than arguing with yourself about whether it was worth doing. She hadn't expected a hit. People who moved the way that woman moved didn't usually show up in a county database. But this hadn't hit the county database. It had bounced, flagged, kicked up to a federal registry that took an hour longer to respond and came back with considerably more than a name. Talk to me, Vance said. Captain, the print match isn't local. It's DOD personnel records, restricted access. Took some doing just to get the flag cleared. Briggs's voice had that particular note in it that told Vance he'd found something that scared him a little. Name on file is Wren Calloway, 27. Former combat medic, cross-trained in precision marksmanship. Decorated. Records partially sealed above my clearance. Calloway, Vance repeated, and something in the back of her mind, some cold administrative filing cabinet she hadn't opened in years, creaked open a drawer. Why does that name sound familiar? Briggs swallowed. Because there's a flag on it, Captain. Cross-reference. Same surname. Service record from about 8 years back. Officer, intelligence specialist. Marguerite Calloway. Vance went still. the cold coffee forgotten in her hand. Killed in a training accident 7 years ago, Briggs said. Overseas facility, classified location, no body recovered for public burial, closed casket funeral, with an empty casket. Which captain? I read that file twice, because I didn't believe it the first time, which is not standard. Even for classified incidents, you don't usually bury an empty box and call it done, unless somebody upstairs really wanted the paperwork finished fast. You're telling me our mystery shooter is that woman's daughter. I'm telling you the DNA cross-reference the system ran automatically says she is. Yes, ma'am. Vance turned and looked back at the tent, at the pale gray canvas sagging under a night's worth of rain, at the small, still shape she knew was lying inside it, awake or pretending to be asleep, giving away exactly nothing. A dead intelligence officer's daughter. A woman trained well enough to erase an ambush team without leaving a single trace of herself behind. Shot 3 days before a flood that just happens to be swallowing this entire county whole. None of it sat right. All of it sat together anyway. The way puzzle pieces sit together, even when you don't yet understand what picture they're supposed to make. Get Nash, Vance said, and don't repeat any of this to anyone outside our unit until I say otherwise. Not the county, not the relief coordinators, nobody. Copy that. Captain, you think she knows? About her mother's file, I mean. The classified stuff. Vance thought about the woman's face in the lantern light the night before. The flicker at the corner of her mouth that wasn't quite a smile. The wall she'd put up around a question as simple as why'd you run? I think, Vance said slowly, that she knows a great deal more than any of us do. I think that's exactly the problem. She stood there a moment longer after Briggs had gone, coffee forgotten entirely now, cold rain finding the gap between her collar and her neck, the way it always did, no matter how carefully she dressed for weather like this. 15 years of service had given her a fairly reliable instinct for the difference between a mystery that would resolve itself if she simply gave it time, and a mystery that was actively, even now, still moving, still dangerous. Still very much unfinished. This one had the second feeling all over it. She could feel it the way she could feel the dam upriver, unseen, straining, a pressure in the air that had nothing to do with barometric readings. Whoever did this to that woman's mother 7 years ago, she thought, is not finished, and they picked this county, this week, this flood, to not be finished in. That was the part that unsettled her most. More than the ambush, more than the classified file, more than the empty casket Briggs had described with a tremor in his young voice. Not that something terrible had happened once, a long time ago, far away, that it appeared to be happening again, right now, in her own county, under her own watch, wearing the ordinary disguise of a disaster nobody was supposed to question. She turned back toward the tent, rain running in sheets off the brim of her cap, and started walking, because there was nothing else useful to do with the unease except carry it forward into whatever came next. Inside the tent, Wren lay with her eyes closed and her breathing even and slow, and she had heard every word. The canvas wasn't as soundproof as the captain probably assumed, and Wren had spent a lifetime learning to listen through walls thinner than this one, through hospital curtains and safe house doors, and once, memorably, through 6 inches of reinforced concrete, with nothing but a glass pressed to the surface and her ear pressed to the glass. She had heard Briggs's voice climb with nerves, had heard the word Calloway, had heard, worse, had heard the words training accident and no body recovered and empty casket, words she had lived inside like a second skin for 7 years, words that had shaped the entire architecture of who she'd become, and hearing them spoken out loud by a stranger outside a flood tent felt like being flayed open along a seam she'd spent years stitching shut. Don't move, she told herself. Don't let your breathing change. Except her breathing did change. Just slightly, just enough, that if anyone had been watching closely they'd have caught it, the small hitch, the tightening around the eyes even with the lids shut. Because it wasn't supposed to come up. Not here, not now. Not shouted across a muddy hillside by a 20-something specialist who had no idea what those words meant to the person lying 20 feet away, pretending to be unconscious. They found me. They found the name. They're going to start asking the questions I've spent 7 years making sure nobody could ask. And underneath that, quieter, harder to look at directly, the thought that had lived in her chest since she was 20 years old and had been handed a folded flag over an empty casket. Mama, what did you actually die for? Or did you die at all? She had never let herself finish that second question out loud. Not once. Not to the therapist the army had assigned her and then quietly stopped assigning her when she stopped showing up. Not to the 2 people she'd let herself call friends in the years since, both of whom she'd since cut contact with, one deliberately and one by circumstance she still didn't fully understand. Not to the empty rooms of the cabin she'd been living out of for the last 18 months, alone, on purpose, because alone was safer for everyone involved. Alone meant nobody else got hurt by the things that seemed to follow her, except now she was lying in a flood tent, with a bullet wound in her side and a captain outside who had just said the words "sealed above my clearance" like they meant something ordinary. And Wren understood, with the particular cold clarity she reserved for moments right before everything got worse. That alone was not going to be an option for very much longer. She opened her eyes and for one long moment did nothing at all except lie there and let the old instinct run its calculations. 15 feet to the flap, IV already removed sometime while she'd been half listening to Briggs outside. Boots by the cot, dry enough. A body that hurt in 4 distinct places and would hold together for maybe half a mile before it didn't. She sat up anyway, slow, careful, one hand braced against the bandage at her side, and swung her legs off the cot and stood, and the tent tilted once gently before it settled. She made it 4 steps before the flap opened from the outside instead of the inside, and Nash stepped through it directly into her path. Not fast, not dramatic, just there, the way a person plants themselves in a doorway when they already suspect what's about to happen, and would rather not have to chase it down a muddy hillside in the dark. "Don't," Nash said. "I have to. You have 4 stitches and a wound that's already started weeping through the dressing again. You won't clear the tree line. You don't know what I can clear. I know what a body looks like right before it gives out on somebody who's too stubborn to notice," Nash said, not moving from the doorway. "I've watched it happen twice this year alone. I'm not watching it happen a 3rd time in my own tent." Wren stood there, swaying very slightly, jaw set, and for a second, something raw moved behind her eyes. Something that had nothing to do with tactics, or exits, or the careful architecture she'd built around herself for 7 years. "They're going to come for the people I care about," she said, low, almost too quiet to hear over the rain. "That's the pattern. That's always the pattern. I stay somewhere, and it costs the people around me. I've watched that happen too, Sergeant. More than twice." "Then let us help you break the pattern instead of running from it alone again," Nash said. "Because from where I'm standing, alone hasn't worked so far. Alone is how you ended up shot and half drowned in a flood." It landed. Wren didn't answer right away, and when she finally sat back down on the edge of the cot, slow, careful, the fight visibly draining out of her shoulders, it wasn't surrender exactly. It was closer to a person setting down a weight they'd carried so long they'd forgotten. It had a name. Just for a moment, just long enough to catch their breath before picking it back up. "Fine," she said again, quieter this time, less like a concession and more like the beginning of something else entirely. "I'll stay. But you should know, Sergeant, alone is the only way I've ever kept anyone alive." "Maybe," Nash said. "Or maybe it's just the only way you've ever tried." She left the water where it was and crossed to the cot instead, and for a moment neither of them said anything, the rain filling the space where words might otherwise have gone. Then Nash reached over, careful, and adjusted the blanket at Wren's shoulder, an unnecessary gesture, purely human, the kind of small correction a person makes not because it's needed, but because their hands want somewhere useful to go. "For what it's worth," Nash said, "I don't think the pattern you're describing is as fixed as you think it is. I think patterns only hold as long as nobody in the room decides to be stubborn about breaking them. You've known me 12 hours. Some people you don't need longer than that for." Nash straightened, moved back toward the folding table, picked her rifle back up out of habit more than immediate need. "Get some rest if you can." Whatever's coming for you, it's not getting here faster because you lay awake staring at canvas. Wren didn't answer, but she did lie back, slow, careful of the wound, and closed her eyes. And for a little while, at least, the tent held nothing but rain and breathing, and the fragile, temporary peace of two strangers who had decided, without quite saying so out loud, to start trusting each other, one small stubborn choice at a time. An hour before dawn, with the rain settled into its long grinding rhythm, and Faraday not yet arrived, and the worst of the night's fear temporarily spent, Nash brought 2 tin cups of coffee into the tent and set one down on the crate beside Wren's cot without being asked. "You don't have to do that," Wren said, looking at the cup like it might be a trick question. "I know I don't. I might not even drink it. Then it'll go cold and I'll have wasted a cup of bad coffee on a stranger. Wouldn't be the worst thing that's happened to me this week." Nash settled onto the overturned crate across from her, cup cradled in both hands, steam curling up into the lantern light. "You've got a look about you. I've seen it before. Not on strangers. On people who've spent a long time taking care of everyone, except themselves, and calling it strength." Wren wrapped her hands around the cup, more for the warmth than any real intention to drink. "That obvious? To somebody who's done 6 years of the same thing?" "Yeah, pretty obvious. You don't strike me as somebody who takes care of everyone else and forgets herself." "Working on it," Nash said. "Some days better than others. My own mother used to say I had a talent for bleeding for other people and calling it a Tuesday." She looked up, something gentler in her face now than the careful triage professionalism from hours before. "She passed 4 years back. I think about her constantly. But I especially think about her on nights like this, hauling people out of water they shouldn't have been in. She used to say the whole reason to save anybody at all was so somebody, somewhere, could go home and tell their mother about it." Something moved across Wren's face, quick and unguarded, gone before she could stop it. "I don't have that, somebody to go home and tell. You've got Odette." "Odette is 7 years of grief, wrapped around a woman I barely remember as anything other than a voice arguing at our kitchen table." Wren's own voice had gone quieter, rawer, stripped of the careful control she'd been maintaining since she woke. "My mother is the only person who ever made me feel like the things I could do with my hands were a gift instead of a warning label. And she's gone. And some nights, I don't even let myself be sure that's true, because not being sure is somehow easier than grieving something you never got to finish saying goodbye to." Nash didn't rush to fill the silence that followed. She'd learned, over 6 years and more triage tents than she liked to count, that the worst thing you could do to a person and handing you something that raw was to immediately try to patch it over with comfort they hadn't asked for. "For what it's worth," Nash said finally, "careful. I don't think grief works the way people tell you it does. I don't think there's a finish line where you get to stop missing somebody and start being fine. I think you just get more practice carrying it, until one day you notice you're carrying it and walking at the same time, instead of just standing still underneath it." Wren looked at her for a long moment, something working behind her eyes. "You sound like you've had practice too. 4 years worth. Does it get lighter?" "No," Nash said honestly. "But your arms get stronger, which from a distance looks about the same, I guess, if you don't examine it too closely." Wren laughed then, short and surprised, a real sound, the first one Nash had heard out of her since she'd hauled her out of the river. It faded fast, but it had been real while it lasted, and something in the tent seemed to loosen because of it. Some tension neither of them had fully named finding, for a moment, somewhere to set itself down. "Thank you," Wren said, "for pulling me out of that water. I know you don't need thanking, it's the job, but I mean it anyway." "You're welcome," Nash said. "For what it's worth, I'd do it again. No hesitation. And I don't say that to just anybody I fish out of a flood." High praise from a woman who fishes people out of floods for a living. "Highest praise I've got tonight," Nash said, and lifted her tin cup in something that was almost, in the dim lantern light, almost a toast. Nash was standing in the tent entrance, having just come in from whatever conversation had happened outside, and the look on her face careful, assessing, Not unkind, but no longer entirely uncomplicated, told Ren everything about what had been said out there, without a single word needing to pass between them. You heard, Ren said. It wasn't a question. I heard, Nash confirmed. Ren closed her eyes again, not to hide this time, just because it was easier to say the next part without watching someone else's face while she said it. Then you already know more about me than I've told a single living person in 7 years, she said. Congratulations, Sergeant. You've got a head start. Vance came in 10 minutes later, and there was no pretending anymore. No 4-second window. No wall thin enough to hide behind. She pulled the folding stool up beside the cot and sat, and for a moment she said nothing at all, just studied Ren's face with the same flat, assessing patience she'd probably used on 100 debriefings before this one. Marguerite Calloway, Vance said finally. Your mother, Ren didn't answer, killed 7 years ago. Except the file's got holes in it big enough to drive a truck through, and I've read a lot of classified files in my career, Ms. Calloway, and most of them are boring, in the specific way that classified things usually are. This one isn't boring. This one reads like somebody wanted it closed fast and closed quiet. You shouldn't have that file at all, Ren said. Her voice had gone very flat, very controlled. The voice of someone standing on a very thin surface and trying not to let anyone hear the ice cracking underneath her. Nobody outside a 2-stars office is supposed to have that file. My specialist has a talent for finding doors that are supposed to be locked. Then your specialist should learn when to stop opening them. Maybe, Vance said. Or maybe he opened exactly the right one, because I've got 6 people alive because of you, a bullet wound in your side, that you dressed like a surgeon, and a mother with a sealed file, and an empty casket, and none of that adds up to a coincidence, Miss Calloway. It adds up to a story, and I think you're the only one who knows how it starts. Ren was quiet for a long moment, looking at the sagging gray canvas above her, listening to the rain that hadn't stopped in 11 hours and showed no sign of stopping in the next 11 either. You want to know how it starts, she said finally, very quietly. It starts with me being 12. She stopped herself, hard, a visible flinch, and corrected. It starts with me being 20 years old, and standing in a chapel with a folded flag in my hands and a box in front of me that I was never allowed to open, and being told by 3 separate officers, very kindly, very firmly, that some things are safer left buried, and I believed them. For 7 years, I believed them. And now? Ren turned her head finally and looked directly at Vance for the first time since she'd woken. Now somebody put a bullet in me, 3 days, before a dam broke in a town I'd never heard of before this week, she said. And I don't believe in coincidences either, Captain. I just believe in them less than you do, because I've had longer to practice. The rest of that morning moved the way disaster mornings always moved, which was to say, in pieces, out of order, urgent, and then suddenly, briefly, unbearably slow. Vance had a county to keep from drowning, and could not, in good conscience, spend the whole day sitting on a folding stool untangling a 7-year-old classified mystery, however much the specialist in her wanted to. She left 2 people posted near the tent, not guards. She told herself, though she suspected Ren understood exactly what they were, regardless of the label, and went back to the work of moving families off the low road and shoring up what could still be shored. Odette Faraday arrived a little after noon. She came in a rented pickup with county press credentials taped inside the windshield and a laptop bag slung crosswise over a rain jacket that had clearly seen better decades. And she found her way to the relief command post with the particular unbothered persistence of a woman who had been talking her way past checkpoints since before half the soldiers currently manning them had been born. I'm looking for whoever's running triage intake, Faraday said to the first uniform she found, which happened to be Briggs. I've got a name I need confirmed. Ma'am, this is an active disaster site. If you've got press questions, you'll want to go through the county coordinator. I'm not here for a disaster quote, son. I'm here because a friend of mine called me at 2 a.m. and told me her prints just hit a federal database. They weren't supposed to hit, and I've spent 7 years waiting for a phone call exactly like that one. Briggs blinked. Ma'am, I don't have authorization to discuss. Then get me someone who does. Fast, because if the name I think just surfaced actually surfaced, you people are sitting on something a great deal bigger than a flood, and I'd rather we figure that out before the dam finishes the job somebody clearly started. It took some doing. Briggs radioing Nash, Nash radioing Vance, Vance leaving a half-finished conversation with the county's chief engineer about spillway integrity to walk back down to the command post with rain running off her cap in sheets. But 20 minutes later, Odette Faraday was sitting across a folding table from Captain Odessa Vance, with a laptop open between them and an expression that had gone somewhere in the last 20 minutes, from brisk professional urgency to something much rawer. Her name's Wren, Vance said. Wren's Calloway. Faraday's hands, which had been moving toward the laptop keyboard, stopped completely. She's alive, Faraday said, and it wasn't quite a question, more like a woman confirming a fact she'd hoped for and never quite let herself believe. God, she's actually alive. You know her. I knew her mother. Faraday's voice had thinned out, gone careful in the way voices go when a person is deciding, sentence by sentence, exactly how much of the truth is safe to hand across a table to someone they just met. Margot Calloway. We worked together years back before she started again. I was investigating something. Margot was helping me from the inside because she'd found the same thing I had, and she had access I didn't. And then Margot died. Except, Vance repeated. Except I never believed it, Faraday said. Not for one single day in 7 years. And I've been trying to prove it since. Mostly alone, mostly getting nowhere. Because everyone with the authority to open that file has decided it's safer left closed. And now I'm sitting in a flood zone, learning that her daughter just washed up out of a river with a bullet in her. 3 days after saving your entire convoy from an ambush that officially does not exist in any incident report filed with the county or the state. She looked up, and there was something fierce in her eyes now, something that had been banked for a long time and had just caught air. Captain, I don't think that's a coincidence. I think somebody's picking up exactly where they left off 7 years ago. And I think Wren is standing right in the middle of it, whether she knows it or not. Vance looked out through the commandant's open flap at the gray sheet of rain, at the river continuing its slow, patient climb toward the dam that the engineers kept insisting, in increasingly frightened language, was not going to hold. She knows it, Vance said quietly. I don't think she's known anything else for 7 years. Faraday pulled the laptop closer and turned it so Vance could see the screen, a tangle of scanned documents and highlighted spreadsheet rows that meant nothing to Vance at a glance and, she suspected, meant everything to the woman who'd spent 7 years assembling them. Before Margot died, we were tracking a pattern in disaster contracting. Small counties, mostly rural, mostly overlooked by anybody with a national news budget. Federal relief money gets allocated, gets routed through a private logistics contractor instead of directly through the Guard or FEMA, and somewhere in that routing a percentage just evaporates. Not enough to trigger an automatic audit, just enough. Spread across enough counties, over enough years, to add up to something substantial. And Margot found the company. Margot found several companies, Faraday said. Shell structures, mostly, dissolved and reformed under new names every few years, so the pattern never got long enough to draw attention. But there was one relationship that kept surfacing no matter how many times the shell changed its skin. A logistics contractor with unusually good relationships inside certain Guard support units. Suspiciously good. The kind of good that doesn't happen by accident in a bidding process that's supposed to be competitive. She tapped the screen. The current skin is called Ridgeline Relief Group. 4 years old on paper. Financially, though the money trail underneath it goes back a lot further than 4 years, if you know where to squint. Vance felt something settle cold in her stomach, the particular sensation of a coincidence refusing, one more time, to remain a coincidence. I've seen that name on trucks in this county twice this week. I know, Faraday said quietly. That's why I drove out here the second Margot's flag hit. Because if Ridgeline's already operating in Larkspur Hollow, and the dam that's supposedly about to fail just happens to be the dam that's been flagged for repair funding and never received it. She let the sentence trail, let Vance finish it herself. Then somebody's using a real disaster to hide something that isn't natural at all, Vance said. That's what I think happened to Margot, Faraday said. I think she got close enough to prove it. And instead of a courtroom, she got a training accident, and an empty casket, and a daughter who was told, very kindly, very firmly, to stop asking questions. Her hands, folded on the table, had gone white-knuckled. I am not going to let that happen to Ren too, Captain. Not this time. Not while I've got breath left to make noise about it. Faraday went in to see her alone. Vance allowed it, against most of her own instincts, because something in the older woman's face when she said I knew her mother had carried a weight. Vance recognized not performance, not an angle, just the specific gravity of grief that had never been allowed to finish. Ren was sitting up on the cot when Faraday came through the tent flap, color better than the night before, IV line removed. One hand pressed lightly against the bandaged wound at her side, like she was holding something in that wanted very badly to come out. She looked at Faraday for a long moment. Something in her face shifted, cracked, just slightly, the wall coming down half an inch before it caught itself and went back up. "You're Odette," Ren said. "Mama talked about you." Before, Faraday's breath caught audibly. "You remember me? I remember a woman who used to sit at our kitchen table until 2 in the morning arguing with my mother about sourcing and redaction and things I wasn't supposed to be listening to from the stairs." A ghost of something almost like a smile. I was always supposed to be listening to from the stairs. Mama used to say I had ears like a bat and a conscience like a stone wall, because I never told on either of you. Faraday laughed, wet and sudden, and pressed the back of her hand hard against her mouth for a second before she trusted herself to speak again. "God, you look like her. You look exactly like her." People used to say that. Ren's voice had gone quiet. I stopped letting people say it after the funeral, after the empty box. Ren said, and there it was, out in the open air of the tent for the first time in 7 years, the thing she had never once said aloud to another living person. I never believed it either, Odette. Not for one single day. But I didn't have anybody to say that, to who'd have believed me back. And eventually you learn that saying a thing out loud that nobody else will confirm just makes you sound like you're coming apart. So I stopped saying it. I kept it. Quiet. And I got very good at disappearing. Because disappearing felt like the safest version of the truth I could live inside without anyone locking me up for it. Faraday pulled the folding stool close and sat, and for a moment, neither of them said anything at all, just looked at each other, across 7 years of separate, parallel grief that had never once been allowed to meet in the same room. "I've been trying to prove it," Faraday said finally. "Since the day of the funeral, I never stopped. I got close twice, and both times the ground shifted under me before I could finish sources. Went quiet, records got reclassified overnight, once a whole department got reorganized out of existence 2 weeks before I was supposed to get an interview. Somebody with a great deal of reach has spent 7 years making sure this stays buried. And now I turn up bleeding in a flood." "And now you turn up bleeding in a flood," Faraday agreed. 3 days after you erase an ambush team nobody's supposed to know exists, in a county that's about to lose a dam that engineers were flagging as unsafe 18 months ago, and somehow never got funded for repair. She reached across and, very carefully, very gently, closed her hand over Ren's. "I don't think you're caught in the middle of something new, sweetheart. I think you're standing exactly where your mother was standing 7 years ago. I think somebody's finishing what they started." Ren looked down at their joined hands for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had gone very low, very steady, the particular steadiness of a person setting down a great weight they have carried alone for a very long time, and finding, to their own surprise, that their arms don't know how to feel without it. "Then tell me everything," she said. "Everything you and Mama were working on. Every name, every date, every piece you were never able to prove. Because I've spent 7 years thinking I lost her to an accident I couldn't understand." She lifted her eyes, and there was something new in them now. Something that hadn't been there the night before, when she was calculating exits and IV lines and the fastest route to disappearing again. "I'm done not understanding, Odette, whatever this is. Whoever's still out there finishing it. Because I want to understand all of it, and then I want to be standing in the room when they finally have to answer for it." Faraday told her, slowly, carefully, watching Ren's face the whole time. For the moment, it might become too much, the shell companies, the disaster contracting pattern, the name Ridgeline Relief Group, surfacing again and again under different skins across different counties. The 18 months of ignored repair requests for a dam that had just tonight apparently decided to finish failing on schedule. Wren listened without interrupting, hands folded very still in her lap, and Nash, standing near the tent flap, pretending to check a supply manifest, watched her absorb it and thought she had never seen a person hold so much stillness around so much grief at once. "There's one more thing," Faraday said, quieter now, reaching into her bag and drawing out a single folded page, edges soft with handling, the particular wear of a document that had been unfolded and refolded 100 times by someone who couldn't quite let it go and couldn't quite look at it either. "Your mother sent me this 2 days before she died. I never knew what to do with it. It's a list of names. People inside the logistics chain she suspected were compromised. Most of them checked out over the years, retired, cleared, dead ends. But one name on this list is still active duty, still working disaster logistics, still, as of 18 months ago, signing off on maintenance budgets for dams exactly like this one." Wren took the page with hands that had gone very careful, the way hands go careful around something that might shatter, or might worse, turn out to be entirely solid and real. She read the name, and something crossed her face that Nash couldn't name, at first not recognition exactly. Something quieter and stranger than that, something closer to a door she'd walked past 1,000 times, finally being tried and found, to her own horror, unlocked. "I know this name," Wren said very softly. "This isn't a stranger, Odette. This is somebody I've known my whole life." She didn't say who, not yet. Her hand had started, almost imperceptibly, to shake, and she folded the page back along its worn crease and pressed it flat against her chest like she could keep whatever she'd just recognized from getting any further out into the open air of the tent than it already had. "Wren," Faraday said gently. "Who is it?" "Not tonight," Wren said, and her voice had gone thin, stretched over something that sounded, for the first time since she'd woken in that tent, less like control and more like the effort of holding control together by force. I need to be sure. Before I say a name like that out loud and I'm wrong, or worse, before I say it out loud and I'm right." She closed her eyes. "Give me tonight, Odette. Just tonight." Faraday didn't push. She reached over instead and closed her hand around Wren's again. The same gesture from an hour before, and this time, Wren let her hand stay there, and for a moment, the two of them just sat like that, 2 generations of the same unfinished grief, while outside the rain kept coming down over a county that had no idea yet how much of its own disaster had been written in advance. Night came down over Larkspur Hollow, heavier than the day had, the rain not letting up so much as changing its ice mind about how it wanted to fall, in long hammering sheets, and then in a fine, relentless mist, and then in sheets again. And by the time full dark settled, the river had climbed another 2 feet against the sandbag line. The guard had spent the afternoon reinforcing. Vance moved most of her people to a forward staging area, a half-mile up from the low road, close enough to respond if the dam gave, far enough to have a head start if it did. She left Nash and 2 others at the medical tent with Wren, who was walking now, slow and careful but walking, and who had spent the last 4 hours in low, urgent conversation with Odette Faraday that Vance had deliberately not tried to overhear, because some griefs deserved privacy even in the middle of a disaster. It was Briggs who noticed it first. Just past 10 that night, doing a perimeter check more out of restlessness than protocol, he caught a flicker of movement along the tree line, above the staging area. Wrong shape, wrong rhythm. Not the flood debris, or wandering livestock, or spooked deer that made up most of a night like this one. He didn't call it in right away. He watched, the way he'd been trained to watch, and counted. 4 shapes, moving with intention, moving toward the medical tent. He keyed his radio, with hands that had gone very steady, the fear translating itself, the way it sometimes did for him, straight into precision. "Captain. Contact 4 unknowns, tree line north of the medical tent, moving with purpose. This isn't looters, this is coordinated." Vance's voice came back instantly, no hesitation in it at all. "Get everyone inside the tent line into cover. I'm moving." Inside the tent, Nash heard the radio traffic, a half second before she heard anything else, and she was already reaching for her weapon, when Wren, sitting on the edge of the cot, with Faraday beside her, went very still in a way Nash recognized now, the 4-second stillness, the listening. "They found me," Wren said quietly. "Found you how?" Nash said, already moving toward the tent flap, already scanning. "Nobody outside the county has your location. We haven't even filed a public intake report. It doesn't matter how." Wren was on her feet, the careful walking from an hour ago gone, replaced by something faster, harder, a version of her body, moving the way it must have moved on that ridge 3 nights ago. "It matters that they did. Get her out." A nod toward Faraday. "Get her out first." "I'm not leaving," Faraday started. "You're the only person alive who can prove what happened to my mother," Wren said, and there was no room for argument in it at all. The flat, absolute calm of someone who had already run every calculation and arrived at the only answer that made sense to her. "You die tonight. That proof dies with you. I am not letting that happen. Move." The first shot came through the canvas wall, a half second later, close enough that Nash felt the displaced air of it against her cheek, and after that, there was no more time for arguing about anything at all, because the lantern went first, shattering somewhere near the tent pole, throwing the whole space into a strobing half-dark, lit only by the muzzle flashes starting to stitch orange light through the canvas from at least 2 directions now. And because the second shot came lower, meant for the cots, meant for whoever might still be lying down where a body was supposed to be lying down at this hour, and because Wren was already moving before the second shot finished its arc, already shoving Faraday sideways and down behind the overturned supply crate, already reaching for the fallen weapon at the feet of the man who'd come through the tent flap first and hadn't expected the wounded woman on the cot to still have hands fast enough to matter, which she did. Nash would think about that for a long time afterward, not the danger of it, though the danger was real enough, but the economy of it, the way Wren moved like every motion had already been rehearsed 1,000 times. Somewhere Nash was never going to be allowed to ask about. No wasted steps, no hesitation, just a woman doing exactly what her body had been built, over years, by someone who loved her enough to make sure she'd survive nights just like this one, to do without being told. "Behind the truck," Wren said, voice flat, already moving toward the tear in the canvas. "Now Odette, go. Outside." The night had turned into a strange geometry of flashlight beams and muzzle flash and rain, coming down in silver diagonal lines through all of it, and Vance was already coming up the slope at a dead run with her weapon up, shouting positions, shouting names, the whole staging area erupting into the particular controlled chaos of trained people responding to an untrained threat, because that was what it was underneath all the noise. Untrained. The 4 men who'd come out of that tree line moved with equipment and confidence, but not with instinct, not with the kind of instinct that only comes from having done this so many times the fear burns all the way through. Briggs and 2 others flanked from the east and caught one of them reloading, clumsy, a half second too slow, and it was over for him before he'd finished the motion. Nash laid down fire through the tent's ruined north seam with hands that shook only slightly, only at the very end, once the adrenaline had somewhere to go besides the trigger, and Ren went low and fast along the tent's east wall, using the dark and the rain and the general chaos, the way she must have used the tree line 3 nights before. And when a 5th shape resolved out of the murk, directly in her path, weapon already swinging toward her, she didn't hesitate at all. 2 shots, center mass. The man went down and didn't get back up, and Wren didn't stop to look at him, didn't stop for anything, just kept moving toward the sound of Faraday's voice behind the supply truck, like the rest of the world had gone silent except for that one thread she needed to follow. What happened over the next 11 minutes would end up, later, compressed and flattened in the incident reports, into a handful of clinical lines, hostile contact, 4 assailants, engaged and repelled, no friendly casualties. 1 hostile, detained the way violence always got flattened once it was safely in the past tense. But living through it, for the people inside that tent, felt like nothing so orderly. It felt like the whole world narrowing down to muzzle flash and canvas tearing, and the particular smell of wet mud and cordite mixing together into something that would live in the back of several people's throats for weeks afterward. Nash returned fire through the tent's north seam, laying down enough suppression to buy Briggs and two others the 4 seconds they needed to flank from the tree line's eastern edge. Vance came up from the staging area at a dead run, weapon up, voice cutting through the chaos in short, precise bursts of command that somehow, impossibly, kept 4 terrified young soldiers from getting themselves killed doing something brave and stupid. And Ren moved like something out of that ridge 3 nights ago, like the woman Nash had glimpsed for 4 seconds through muzzle flash and never forgotten. Wounded, stitches still healing under a field, dressing that had already started to bleed through again with the strain of movement. She got Faraday behind the overturned supply truck, got a weapon out of a fallen assailant's hands with a speed that made Nash's stomach drop, even in the middle of active combat, and put down covering fire with a precision that suggested she had, in fact, done exactly this before, more than once, somewhere nobody in this tent was ever going to be cleared to ask about. It ended the way these things end when one side has training and desperation, and the other side only has orders, and a plan that had just gone catastrophically wrong. 3 of the 4 attackers broke and ran into the flooded dark, choosing the river's uncertainty over the certainty of what was waiting for them on the ground. The 4th went down hard, hit twice, alive but not going anywhere, and it was Vance who reached him first. Boot planted on the wrist, still curled around a dropped weapon, rifle leveled at a face gone gray with pain and fear in roughly equal measure. "Who sent you?" Vance said. Not a question, a demand with no room left in it for anything but an answer. The man on the ground said nothing, but his eyes, wide and frightened, and already starting to slide toward shock, flicked once, just once, involuntary, the kind of tell a person can't help, even when every instinct in their training is screaming at them to hold still toward the tree line to the north, toward the direction the other 3 had come from, toward, Vance understood with a sudden cold certainty, the direction of the company logo stitched small and easy to miss on the shoulder of his tactical vest, a logo she'd seen twice already this week on the side of relief supply trucks rolling through the county with government contracts and government paperwork and government trust behind every mile of the road they drove. Ridgeline Relief Group. She didn't say the name out loud. Not yet. Not until she understood exactly how deep this went and how many more people standing in the rain around her tonight might already be part of it without knowing it themselves. But she filed it the way she'd learned to file things over 11 years, of making impossible calls in impossible weather, and she looked back, over her shoulder, at the medical tent, at Nash helping a shaking but unbroken Faraday out from behind the overturned truck, at Ren Calloway, standing in the mud with someone else's weapon, still smoking, in her hand, and her stitches bleeding through her shirt, and an expression on her face that had nothing left in it of the careful, walled-off stranger who'd woken up on that cot the night before. What was left instead was something harder, something that had been waiting 7 years for exactly this moment to arrive, and had tonight, finally, found it. "They know who I am now," Ren said quietly, into the rain, into the dark, into the sound of the river, still climbing somewhere behind them all, which means we're not chasing a mystery anymore, Captain. She lowered the weapon, slow, deliberate, and looked at Vance across the ruined ground between them with an expression that was equal parts grief and resolve. The 2 things braided together so tightly by now that Vance suspected Ren herself couldn't have separated them, even if she'd tried. "We're chasing the people who killed my mother," Ren said, "and I am not stopping until I find out exactly how far up this goes." Behind them, unnoticed by anyone in the chaos of the aftermath, the river climbed another inch against the sandbags, patient, indifferent, carrying its slow accumulation of debris and secrets down toward a dam that the whole county had been promised, over and over, for 18 long months, was going to hold. It was not, as it happened, going to hold much longer at all. Dawn found them in the wreckage of the medical tent, canvas torn open to the sky in 3 places. rain finally thinning to a mist that drifted sideways through the gaps like something exhaling. Vance stood over the man they'd taken alive, wrists zip-tied, a medic from her own unit working on the wounds he'd taken without much gentleness, and without much cruelty either, just the flat professional care of people who had learned a long time ago that even a man who tried to kill you deserved a bandage if he was down and done. He hadn't talked yet. He would, eventually, Vance suspected, once the adrenaline wore off and the reality of federal charges started to sink in further than the pain did. But for now, he sat with his eyes fixed somewhere past all of them, jaw locked, and said nothing at all. And Vance let him have the silence, because there was work that mattered more right now than one frightened contractor's confession. She found Wren sitting on the tailgate of a supply truck, with a fresh dressing pressed hard against her side. Nash crouched in front of her, checking the wound with hands that had gone gentle again, now that the fight was over, and Faraday standing a few feet off, with her arms wrapped around herself, staring out at the gray water still climbing, inch by patient inch, toward the sandbag line. "You held your own out there," Vance said, come to stand beside the tailgate. "I've had practice," I noticed. Vance studied her for a long moment, rain-soaked, exhausted, blood soaking slowly back through a bandage that had clearly given up trying to hold. "The man we caught, he's wearing a company patch. Ridgeline Relief Group." Something moved through Wren's face, quick and sharp, confirmation landing on top of a suspicion that had apparently already half-formed on its own. "Same company running supply through this county." "Same company," Vance said. "Which means whoever wants you dead isn't operating from some hidden compound in the woods, Miss Calloway. They're operating out of trucks with government contracts, parked in plain sight, rolling through checkpoints my own people are helping wave through." "Then we're not looking for an enemy hiding in the tree line," Wren said slowly, the shape of it settling into place behind her eyes even as she said it out loud for the first time. "We're looking for one wearing a badge somebody trusts." Nash finished tying off the new dressing and sat back on her heels, looking up at Wren with an expression that had shifted sometime in the last 12 hours, from professional caution into something that looked, unmistakably, like an alliance being forged in real time. "There's still a dam that isn't going to hold," Nash said quietly. "Whatever this is, whoever's behind it, we've still got a county to get through tonight before we can even start chasing it properly." "Then we get through tonight," Wren said. She looked out at the water, at the mist rising off it in thin gray ribbons, at the shape of the dam, somewhere upriver, that none of them could see yet, but all of them could feel, the way you feel a held breath in a room, even before anyone tells you why everyone's gone quiet. "And tomorrow, we start asking the questions somebody's spent 7 years making sure nobody ever got the chance to ask." Faraday turned from the water to look at her, and for just a moment the exhaustion in her face gave way to something steadier, something that looked almost like the ghost of the woman who used to argue at a kitchen table until 2 in the morning, with a friend who was still, in every way that mattered, not finished fighting yet. "Your mother would be proud of you," Faraday said. "For what it's worth." Wren didn't answer right away. She looked down at her own hands, steady now, steady the way her mother had taught her to be steady, on a stretch of range land, 2 states from anywhere, a lifetime and a whole grief ago. "I hope so," she said finally, quiet, almost to herself, "because I'm not stopping until I find out exactly what she died trying to prove. And if Ridgeline Relief Group had anything to do with it, Odette, if this dam, this county, this whole flood, turns out to be exactly the kind of cover somebody's used before then, whoever's still standing on the other end of that chain of command is going to learn, very soon, that they didn't finish what they started 7 years ago. Behind them, the sky over Larkspur Hollow had begun, almost imperceptibly, to lighten, gray giving way to a paler gray, the storm not broken yet but loosening its grip by degrees. And somewhere upriver, unseen, unheard, the first hairline fracture had already begun creeping across the spillway wall of the Miller's Fork Dam, patient, indifferent, following its own dark schedule toward a morning none of them were fully prepared for. The county behind them would wake in a few hours to sandbags and mud and the slow, grinding work of counting what the water had taken, unaware that the real reckoning had barely begun at all. Morning arrived over Larkspur Hollow, the color of dishwater, and nobody in the county called it a good sign, because good signs didn't come with 3 inches of new mud caked over every porch step between the low road and the church, because good signs didn't come with a National Guard captain standing over a zip-tied prisoner at 6 in the morning, asking questions in a voice that had stopped bothering to sound patient. Except this morning did come with one small mercy, if you wanted to call it that. The rain had finally thinned to mist, which meant, for the first time in 6 days, a person could stand outside for longer than a minute without getting soaked through to the bone. Vance used that mercy the way she used everything else lately, efficiently, without wasting it on rest. "Talk to me," she said to the man on the ground, the one Wren had put down without hesitation the night before, the one now sitting against the wheel of a supply truck with his wrists bound and a Ridgeline relief group patch stitched crooked on his shoulder, like it had been sewn on in a hurry by somebody who didn't much care how it looked. "You've got a company logo and a federal disaster zone charge stacking up against you. I can make one of those things a lot heavier than the other, depending how the next 10 minutes go," he said. "Nothing." "Fine," Vance said. "Then I'll talk. You're wearing the same patch I've watched roll through 2 checkpoints this week on trucks carrying government contracts, which means somebody with real authority signed off on your company being here, which means whoever sent you after a wounded woman in a flood tent last night isn't hiding in the woods somewhere. They're hiding in plain sight, inside my own supply chain." Still nothing, but his eyes flicked, involuntary, toward the phone Briggs was holding 6 feet away. Screen cracked from the fall, and Vance filed that flick the same way she'd filed the one from the night before. "Get it open," she said to Briggs. "Whatever's on there, I want it before this county finishes drowning." She stood there a moment after giving the order, watching the mist lift slowly off the standing water beyond the fence line, and let herself feel, just briefly, the particular exhaustion of a person who has spent a night fighting one disaster only to discover a second one, waiting underneath it, patient, older, far less interested in mercy than the first. She left him to it and crossed to where Nash stood near the wreckage of the medical tent, surveying the torn canvas with the particular grim inventory of someone already calculating what needed replacing before the next storm cell rolled through. Behind them, the river had begun, finally, to ease back a few inches from its highest mark of the night, though nobody standing in the mud this morning mistook that for good news. Easing back wasn't the same as receding, and nobody had heard yet, officially, whether the dam upriver had held through the worst of the night or simply hadn't finished failing. "Any word from the county engineers?" Vance asked. "Nothing solid," Nash said. "Last report before dawn said the spillway's still compromised, but slower than projected. Nobody wants to commit to whether that's good luck or borrowed time. With this week," Vance said, "I'd bet on borrowed time." Nash almost smiled at that tired, threadbare, the kind of almost smile 2 people share after a night neither of them expected to survive intact. "You're not wrong very often, Captain." Vance let herself hold still a moment, watching the water instead of Nash, the way she did whenever a thought wanted more room than a moving conversation could give it. "My own mother used to run a night shift at the county clinic 2 towns over from where I grew up," she said. Quieter now. 40 years, more or less, and nobody outside that clinic ever knew her name. "She used to tell me the whole job was showing up in the dark for people who couldn't thank you properly because they were too busy surviving to notice who'd shown up." She looked toward Wren's silhouette by the truck. "I think about her every time I stand in weather like this. I think she'd have liked that woman. The stubborn ones always got along with her best." "You don't talk about your mother much," Nash said. "Not much reason to, most days." Vance almost smiled, tired, the expression not quite finishing before the moment moved on. Today felt like reason enough. "I wasn't wrong about her either," Vance said, glancing toward the supply truck, where Wren stood a short distance off, arms crossed, watching Briggs work the cracked phone with an intensity that suggested she was 2 seconds from taking it out of his hands and doing it herself. "Whatever she is, whoever she's connected to, she's not the danger in this county. She's the only person in it who actually understands the shape of what we're up against. They found the warehouse address 40 minutes later, buried 3 folders deep in a phone that had taken Briggs most of that time to crack, tucked inside a shipment manifest labeled with a name so ordinary. It might as well have been designed to be forgotten. Sundowner Logistics Overflow, Route 9 Storage. Vance read it twice before she understood why her stomach had gone tight around it. Briggs sat cross-legged on the tailgate the whole time he worked, sleeves pushed up, tongue caught between his teeth in the particular concentration of someone who'd learned most of his hacking from late-night forum threads and had never once expected the skill to matter for anything more serious than unlocking his cousin's old laptop. His hands weren't steady. Nobody's were this morning, but they were fast, and that turned out to matter more. "There's a pattern in the folder structure," he said, not looking up, thumb scrolling. "Whoever set this phone up wasn't sloppy. Everything's compartmented, which means whoever's on the other end of these messages knew exactly how careful they needed to be." He paused. "Except careful people still leave a trail if you know what you're looking for. My cousin taught me that, mostly for reasons that had nothing to do with national security." "Focus, specialist," Vance said, but there wasn't much heat in it. "Copy that, Captain." "That's inside county lines," she said. "That's less than 4 miles from where we're standing." Wren was already on her feet when Vance turned to tell her, jaw set, side still bandaged, moving like a woman who had decided, sometime in the last 12 hours, that stillness was a luxury she'd used up her whole quota of. "Then we go now," Wren said. "You're not cleared for. I put down 2 of the 4 people who tried to kill your medic last night, Captain. I think we're past clearance." Vance held her gaze a long moment. Rain misted between them, soft, indifferent. And because there wasn't time to argue, and because some part of her, the part that had watched this woman move through gunfire like it was choreography, already knew arguing would lose, Vance exhaled once through her nose and nodded. "Nash, Briggs, gear up." The drive out to Route 9 took 11 minutes through standing water that came up past the truck's floorboards twice, and Wren spent most of it with her eyes closed, not resting, just listening, the way she'd learned to listen to engines and tires and the small tells of a vehicle under stress, instead of letting her mind wander toward the thing she still hadn't said out loud. The name, Verleen. She'd known it the second she read it on Faraday's folded page. Known it with the particular sick certainty of recognizing a voice on the other end of a phone line before the person even finishes saying hello. Verleen Shaw, who had sat at Wren's hospital bedside during 2 separate deployments home gone wrong. Verleen Shaw, who had shown up at the funeral with an empty casket and held Wren's in hand through the whole service like she was afraid Wren might simply come apart at the seams if nobody was physically holding the pieces together. Verleen Shaw, who had spent 7 years being the closest thing to a mother Wren had left, and who was, according to a list her actual mother had compiled 2 days before she disappeared, still active duty, still signing logistics budgets, still the word Faraday had used gently, like it might break something if she said it too hard compromised. It's not her, Wren told herself, for what felt like the 100th time since dawn. There's another explanation. There's always another explanation, except there wasn't always another explanation. That was the thing about 7 years spent chasing ghosts. Sometimes you finally found one that had a name and a face and a voice that used to sing off-key in your kitchen while it made coffee, and it turned out not to be a ghost at all. She opened her eyes as the truck slowed. The warehouse sat low and gray behind a chain-link fence, half swallowed by standing water on its northern edge. A single dim light burning inside despite the hour, despite the storm, despite every reason a place like this should have been dark and empty during a flood emergency. "That's not an evacuated building," Nash murmured, crouched beside Wren at the fence line. "That's a building somebody's actively using." "Then let's find out what for," Vance said. They went in through a service door. Briggs had jimmied in under 90 seconds. And what waited on the other side stopped all 4 of them cold for a full 3 heartbeats before anyone spoke. Pallets, rows and rows of them, stacked to the rafters, marked with the same Ridgeline Relief Group logo stitched on the dead man's shoulder outside. But the boxes on those pallets weren't blankets, weren't water, weren't the bottled formula and emergency rations the manifest on the outer wall claimed they were. "Captain," Briggs said, voice gone thin, standing over an open crate near the loading bay. "You need to see this." Vance crossed to him, looked down and went very still. Rifles. Dozens of them, still in factory wrap, nested in foam cut to their exact shape, government serial numbers filed clean off every barrel Vance could see. Wren crouched beside the crate and ran 2 fingers along one of the filed barrels. Slow, deliberate, the way a person touches something they need their hands to confirm even after their eyes already have. "Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing," she said. "Filing a serial number takes time, takes tools, takes somebody who isn't worried about being interrupted while they do it." She looked up. "That's not a smuggler working scared in a back alley somewhere. That's somebody who felt safe enough to do this out in the open, inside a warehouse with a company logo on the door. That's not disaster relief," she said quietly. "That's a weapons cache, moving under a relief company's paperwork, through a federal disaster zone, past checkpoints my own people are helping wave through. They're using the flood as cover," Wren said, and her voice had gone flat, cold. The particular calm she reserved for the moment, right before understanding, turned into something sharper. The dam wasn't an accident that happened to be convenient. It was the plan. Every truck that rolls into this county under a relief banner right now gets almost zero inspection. Everyone's too busy trying to keep people alive to check what's actually inside the boxes. "Which means the flood didn't just happen to help them," Nash said slowly, the shape of it assembling in her own voice as she said it. "Which means somebody wanted this flood." For a moment nobody said anything at all. The warehouse hummed with the low electrical whine of the single working light overhead, and somewhere behind the pallets water dripped steady from a gap in the roofline, marking time the way everything in this county seemed to mark time lately, patient, relentless, indifferent to whether anyone standing underneath it was ready. "How many counties?" Wren said quietly, almost to herself, running a hand along the edge of the nearest crate without quite touching it. "How many other floods, other fires, other disasters that got written off as bad luck, bad infrastructure, bad timing? If this is the playbook, pick a place nobody's watching, let the maintenance lapse, let nature do the demolition, then move whatever needs moving through the chaos while everybody's too busy surviving to ask questions. Then it's not just one dam," Nash finished. "It's a system. It's a system my mother found the shape of 7 years ago," Wren said, "and got buried for finding." Vance had already pulled her radio free, thumb hovering over the transmit key, and for a long moment she simply stood there, weighing the size of what she was about to set in motion. Accusing a lieutenant colonel of treason wasn't a decision a captain made lightly, not even with rifles in unmarked crates and initials in a maintenance log staring her straight in the face. It was the kind of decision that ended careers. Sometimes the wrong career. "Once I make this call," she said, "there's no walking it back. Delaney will know somebody's looking. Whoever's above Delaney will know too." "Then make the call anyway," Wren said, "because the alternative is letting them finish whatever this is in the next county, and the one after that, the same way they almost finished it here." Vance held her gaze a moment longer. Then she keyed the radio and stepped away toward the loading bay to make the call in private, her voice dropping into the clipped, careful cadence of someone building a case sentence by sentence for someone who was going to need convincing. Wren was already moving toward a second doorway at the back of the warehouse, one marked office in stenciled letters gone soft with damp, and what she found inside stopped her harder than the rifles had. A filing cabinet, half its drawers open, papers spilling loose across a desk somebody had left in a hurry, and on top of the mess, weighted down by a coffee mug gone cold, a set of engineering reports, stamped Miller's Fork Spillway maintenance deferral, dated across 18 consecutive months, each one flagged urgent, each one signed off by the same initials at the bottom, in the same tight, hurried hand. "MD, Delaney," Vance said, reading over Wren's shoulder, voice gone hard in a way none of them had heard from her yet. "Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Delaney, 312th Logistics Support Battalion." "I know that name," He's coordinated relief logistics with my unit twice this year alone. He signed off on deferring repairs to a dam that was already flagged as failing, Wren said, reading further down the page. 18 months in a row. Every single flag dismissed. Every single warning buried. She looked up. That's not negligence, Captain. That's a decision. Somebody decided this county could afford to drown. Because a flood this size buys weeks of chaos, nobody's going to look too closely through. It was in the bottom drawer, wedged behind a stack of unrelated invoices, that Nash found the thing that changed the shape of the whole morning all over again. A photograph, old, creased, corners soft with handling. A woman standing at the edge of a runway, somewhere sun-bleached and foreign, dark hair pulled back, a duffel bag over one shoulder, looking back over that shoulder at whoever was holding the camera, with an expression that was equal parts exhaustion and something fiercer underneath it. Nash didn't recognize the face, but she recognized the reaction on Wren's when she turned and held it out. Wren didn't take it right away. She just stood there, hand halfway extended, breath gone somewhere it shouldn't have gone, staring at a photograph of a woman she had spent 7 years believing was buried in an empty casket 2 states from anywhere. That's her, Wren said, and her voice had cracked clean down the middle. That's my mother. Wren, that photo's not 7 years old. Wren's hand was shaking now badly, as she finally took it, turning it toward the office's single dim bulb like better light might change what she was seeing. Look at the timestamp corner. Digital cameras log dates whether you want them to or not. She stopped, swallowed, made herself finish. That's 11 months old, Nash. 11 months, not 7 years. The room went very quiet, which means, Vance said slowly, watching Wren's face, the way you watch a structure you're not sure is going to hold. That whatever happened 7 years ago wasn't what they told me, Wren said. Her voice had dropped to almost nothing, the words coming out clipped, disbelieving, like she was trying them on for the first time, and finding they didn't fit anywhere she'd built for them. She's alive, or she was, 11 months ago, which means either she's still alive right now, somewhere, and she let me believe for 7 years that she wasn't. She couldn't finish that sentence. She didn't have to. Every person standing in that office understood exactly where it ended, and none of them tried to finish it for her, or Faraday said quietly, because she had insisted on coming despite Vance's objections, and was standing in the doorway now, having heard the last of it, face gone pale and strange. She had a reason. Wren, listen to me. Your mother did not walk away from you by choice. I knew her. I knew her for years before either of us knew you existed to worry about. If she let the world believe she was dead, it wasn't cruelty. It was the only shield big enough to put between you and whatever she'd found. Then why not tell me? Wren said, and for the first time since the river, since the flood tent, since the whole strange, endless span of this week, her voice cracked open into something that sounded less like a soldier and more like a 20-year-old girl standing in a chapel with a folded flag in her hands. 7 years, Odette. 7 years of me thinking I had nobody left who understood what my hands were built for. 7 years of me disappearing into cabins and safe houses because I thought staying close to anyone was how I got them killed. If she was out there this whole time, then she was protecting you the only way she knew how, Faraday said, crossing the room, taking both of Wren's hands in hers, steady despite the tremor she could clearly feel running through them. The same way she taught you to breathe on a rifle range when you were 22 years old. Because she loved you enough to do the hard, lonely thing instead of the easy, comforting one. I'm not telling you that makes it right. I'm telling you it's who she was. It's who she still is, if this photograph means what I think it means. Tell me the rest, Wren said. Whatever you were building toward together before. I've only ever gotten pieces from you, Odette. Fragments, a name here, a warning there. I need the whole shape of it now. Faraday hesitated only a moment before she nodded. Your mother believed the pattern started small. A handful of disaster contracts, 5, 6 years before she disappeared, all routed through shell logistics firms that dissolved almost as fast as they formed. She spent 2 years just mapping the ownership structures, cross-referencing state filings against federal disbursement records, looking for the same fingerprints, showing up under different names. Her voice had gone quieter, more careful, the cadence of someone walking back through ground she'd covered 1,000 times alone in the dark. She found 4 counties before this one, 4 floods, 2 wildfires, 1 ice storm that took out a whole power grid for 11 days. Every single time, the same relief contractor pattern moved in behind the disaster. Every single time, an internal audit either never happened or got quietly closed within a year. 4 counties, Wren repeated, and something colder than grief moved across her face now. How many people? I don't have exact numbers. Nobody does. Because that's the whole design of it. Keep the losses small enough, spread out enough, that no single tragedy ever looks connected to the last one. Faraday's hands tightened around Wren's. Your mother was the first person who ever saw all 4 counties on the same map at the same time. I think that's exactly why they couldn't let her keep looking. Wren closed her eyes, breathed once, twice. The old metronome discipline, holding even now, even here, even with the whole architecture of her grief rearranging itself in real time around a single creased photograph. I need to find her, she said, opening her eyes, and there was something new standing behind the grief now, something sharper, something that looked unmistakably like purpose, finding a shape it had been missing for 7 long years. Whatever this is, whoever's still hunting the people who know the truth about that dam, about Ridgeline, about Delaney and his 18 months of buried maintenance flags. If my mother's alive, she's the reason somebody's still trying to finish what they started, which means finding her isn't just for me anymore. It's the fastest way to finish this. Vance's call took longer than anyone expected, and when she came back, around the corner of the loading bay, her face had gone carefully, deliberately blank, the particular blankness of someone working hard, not to let the room see how rattled she actually was underneath it. That's not the face of good news, Wren said. I reported the warehouse, the weapons, Delaney's initials on 18 months of buried maintenance flags. Vance's jaw worked once before she went on. 20 minutes later, I got a call back. Not from the regional office I reported to, from 2 levels above it. Somebody telling me, very politely, that Delaney's logistics record is, quote, under separate review, and that my unit should stand down from independent investigation, pending that review. Stand down, Nash repeated, flat, disbelieving. Stand down, Vance confirmed, which is either the most reasonable caution I've heard all week, or somebody very high up making sure this doesn't move faster than they want it to. She looked at Wren. You said it back at the tent. This isn't hiding in a tree line anymore. It's wearing a badge somebody trusts. I think we just found out how far up that trust runs. So what do we do? Briggs asked, and for the first time since Wren had met him there was no eagerness in it at all. Just the flat unease of a young soldier, discovering the chain of command he'd trusted his whole career might have a rotten link somewhere above his own captain. We keep working, Vance said, quietly, because if somebody wants this buried this fast, that tells me exactly how close we already are to something they can't afford us finding. Her eyes moved to the photograph still held flat against Wren's chest, which means, Miss Calloway, whatever your mother was building towards 7 years ago, we're going to need every piece of it. Odette can still get her hands on, and we're going to need it before whoever made that phone call decides quiet isn't enough. They left the warehouse an hour, but before the county's forward relief teams arrived to formally seize it, Wren already choosing, without quite meaning to, the careful and complicated calculus of who inside her own life could still be trusted with what they'd just found. Wren rode back in silence, the photograph held flat against her chest, the same way she'd held the folded page with Delaney's name on it the night before, and Nash, watching her from across the truck bed, understood without needing to be told that something fundamental had shifted in the woman sitting across from her. Not softened. If anything, something had hardened, resolved, locked into place with the particular finality of a person who has just discovered the fight they thought was finished was, in fact, only getting started. Her phone buzzed twice against her thigh as they crossed back over the county line, and Wren looked down at it, and for a moment something crossed her face that Nash couldn't quite read, relief and unease tangled together so tightly they'd become indistinguishable. Who is it? Nash asked. Wren was quiet a second too long before she answered. Verlene, she said finally, wants to know I'm safe. Says she heard about the flood on the news and couldn't reach me and got worried. A pause, small, almost imperceptible, the kind of pause a person makes right before they decide whether to say the rest of a thought out loud. She's asking to come out here. Says she wants to help however she can. Do you want her to? Wren looked down at the screen a long moment, thumb hovering over the reply. The same hand that had, 12 hours earlier, put down 2 armed men, without a flicker of hesitation now, trembling faintly, over 4 words it didn't yet know how to answer. Part of me still wants to believe none of this touches her, she said. Isn't that strange, Sergeant? I put a bullet in a stranger last night without blinking, and I can't make myself believe the woman who raised me after my own mother disappeared might be capable of something rotten, because believing that means every birthday she remembered, every late night she sat with me after a bad dream, every promise she made at that kitchen table, all of it might have had a second layer. Underneath it I never once thought to check for. Or, Nash said carefully, it means she made one bad decision a long time ago, for reasons that felt like the only option at the time, and she's been trying to live around the shape of it ever since. People aren't always all one thing, Wren. Sometimes the person who held your hand through the worst night of your life and the person who signed something they shouldn't have are the exact same person, just standing at 2 different moments of their own story. That's a generous way to look at it. I've buried people I loved who weren't perfect either, Nash said. Generosity's usually the only way through in the end. Doesn't mean you stop asking the hard questions. Just means you let the answer be complicated instead of deciding it in advance. I don't know anymore, she said quietly. I've trusted that woman with everything I had left for 7 years. And now there's a name on a list my mother wrote 2 days before the world told me she died. And it says Verlene's still active, still signing budgets, still, she stopped herself, throat working, and looked back out at the grey water, still standing in the ditches along the road, refusing, even now, to fully recede, because the memory came up anyway, uninvited, the way memories do, when a person's guard has been worn thin by grief and gunfire and not nearly enough sleep. Verlene at the kitchen table, the week after the funeral, wrapping both hands around Wren's the exact way Faraday just had in that warehouse office, saying, low and fierce, I promised your mother, a long time ago, I'd look after you if anything ever happened to her. That's not a promise I'm walking back on now, baby. Not ever. Wren had believed her completely, had built years of quiet trust on top of that single kitchen table promise, the way a person builds a house on a foundation they never once thought to inspect. Except foundations could crack without anyone noticing, until the whole house tilted sideways one morning, and you finally saw the fault line running straight through the middle of everything you thought was solid. I don't know if I'm about to let the only family I've got left back into my life, Sergeant, Wren said, or if I'm about to find out she was never who I thought she was at all. Nash didn't have an answer for that. Nobody in the truck did. The silence held a long while, comfortable in its own strange way, the kind of silence people only manage once they've already decided to trust each other with the parts of a story that still don't have endings yet. The rain had stopped entirely by the time they crossed back into the staging area, but the sky overhead stayed the same flat, undecided gray it had been holding all week, as if even the weather understood there was still a great deal left unresolved, and wasn't quite ready to commit to which way it was going to break. Wren typed 4 words back, slow, deliberate, and hit send before she could talk herself out of it. Yes, come find me. And somewhere behind that small, ordinary decision, unseen by anyone standing in that truck, a much larger machinery had already begun turning, patient, indifferent, exactly the way the river had turned 3 nights, before it finally rose high enough for anyone to notice. The county behind them was already beginning the long, unglamorous work of counting what 6 days of rain had cost it, unaware that the true cost was still being tallied, somewhere far above any of their heads, in offices none of them had clearance to enter, by people who had learned a long time ago how to make devastation look, on paper, like nothing more than bad weather and worse luck. Verlene Shaw arrived at the staging area a little after 4 in the afternoon, driving a car too clean for a county still ankle-deep in mud, and Wren watched her get out of it from 30 yards away, with a stillness that felt, for the first time in 7 years, like something other than relief, because relief was supposed to feel warm. This felt like standing at the edge of a drop she couldn't see the bottom of. Verlene crossed the lot fast, arms already opening, face already arranging itself into the exact expression. Wren had spent 7 years trusting without question worry, tenderness, the particular fierce love of a woman who had shown up at a funeral with an empty casket and never once let go of Wren's hand through the whole service. Baby. Verlene's voice cracked on the word. I have been out of my mind. The news said this whole county nearly went under. I'm fine, Wren said. You don't look fine. You look like you haven't slept in a week. I haven't. Verlene reached for her, and Wren let the embrace happen, arms going around her, the way they had 100 times before. Except this time, Wren's eyes stayed open over Verlene's shoulder, watching the tree line, watching the road, watching everything. Except the one thing she actually needed to be watching, which was the woman in her arms. I found something, Wren said, pulling back. A list. My mother made it 2 days before she disappeared. Something crossed Verlene's face. Quick. Gone. Except not quite gone enough. What kind of list? Names, Wren said. People she thought were compromised inside the logistics chain. She held Verlene's gaze steady, the old metronome discipline running even now. Even here, watching for the flicker her mother had taught her to watch for in every face that mattered. Your name was on it, Verlene. The silence that followed lasted 3 full seconds. Wren counted them, because 3 seconds was long enough. 3 seconds was the exact length of time it took an honest person to be confused and an unprepared liar to decide which lie to reach for first. That's Verlene's hand came up to her own throat, a gesture Wren had seen her make 1,000 times, over 1,000 ordinary conversations. Except this time it looked staged, rehearsed, a half-beat too slow to be reflex. Sweetheart, that's insane. Your mother and I worked together for years. Why would she... I didn't say what kind of compromised, Wren said quietly. I never told you that part. Verlene went very still. So tell me how you already knew what I meant. Nash and Vance had drifted closer without either of them noticing, close enough to intervene, far enough to let the moment breathe, and Faraday stood at the edge of the lot, with her arms wrapped around herself, watching a friendship she'd known for 2 decades come apart in real time, and unable to do a single thing to slow it down. The evening light had gone long and gold behind them all, indifferent to the wreckage unfolding underneath it, the way ordinary daylight always seemed to be. Wren. Verlene's voice had dropped, pleading now, all pretense of confusion abandoned. Whatever you think you found, whatever that list says, I need you to remember everything else, every birthday, every bad night. That was real. All of that was real. Was it, Wren said? Or was it easier to love me than to look too closely at what loving me was covering for? Everything after that happened fast, the way violence always happened fast. Once the last honest question had finally been asked out loud, and there was no more room left in the conversation for anything except the truth or a fight. Verlene chose the fight. Her hand moved toward the bag at her hip, and Wren was already moving before it finished the motion. Years of her mother's training collapsing 7 years of grief and love and betrayal into a single clean, brutal reflex. And she had Verlene's wrist locked and the weapon on the ground before either of them had time to feel the horror of what was happening between them. Don't, Wren said, breathing hard. Weapon kicked away. Verlene pinned against the side of her too clean car. Don't you dare make me choose between what my hands know how to do and what's left of the woman who used to sing off-key in my kitchen. Don't make me choose, Verlene. Verlene's face crumpled finally, all the way, 7 years of careful performance collapsing, at once into something raw and exhausted, and, underneath all of it, genuinely, terribly sorry. They had my brother, Verlene said, and her voice had gone to almost nothing. 7 years ago, your mother found the pattern, found the shell companies, found the name at the top of the chain, and I panicked. I told them she was close. I didn't know what they'd do. I swear to you, Wren, I did not know. You knew enough to keep doing it for 7 years. Because once you're in, there's no version of getting out that doesn't cost somebody everything, Verlene said. I told myself I was protecting you by staying close. I told myself that lie so many times I almost believed it. How much did they pay you? Ren asked. Flat, not cruel, just needing finally to know the whole shape of it. Enough to keep my brother alive, Verlene said. Not enough to ever once feel clean about it. Every dollar felt like swallowing glass, Ren. Every single one. She looked up, eyes red, ruined. I am not asking you to forgive me. I don't think there's a version of forgiveness big enough for this. I just need you to know that loving you was never the lie. The silence was the lie, and I have hated myself for it every single day since. It was Vance who reached them first, weapon drawn, Nash a half step behind, and it was Vance's voice that cut through the ragged silence with the flat, procedural calm of someone who had spent a career learning exactly how to hold a moment like this together without letting it shatter. Step back, Miss Calloway. Ren didn't move at first. Then she did, slow, releasing Verlene's wrist, stepping back into the space Vance had made for her, and Verlene sank down against the car door, with her hands pressed over her face, shaking, undone. There's more, Verlene said, muffled, from behind her hands. You need to know who's actually above Delaney. It was never Delaney running this. He's a name on a form, the man who's been running it since before your mother ever started asking questions. She said the name, and for the second time in 3 days, the whole shape of Ren's world rearranged itself around a single sentence. Everything she thought she understood about this ordeal reorganizing itself, in an instant, around a man whose face she had never once had reason to think about. Grant Wexler had built Ridgeline Relief Group out of 3 failed shell companies and 1 very patient decade, and when federal agents finally arrived at his office, 2 counties over that evening, summoned not by Vance's stalled chain of command but by Odette Faraday, who had spent the afternoon feeding everything they'd found directly to a federal contact who owed her a debt 7 years old, and had finally agreed to collect on it properly. They found him at his desk with a half-packed bag and a boarding pass open on his laptop screen. He didn't run. Ren watched it happen, from across the parking lot, arms crossed, breath fogging faintly in the cooling evening air, and felt a strange, quiet satisfaction settle over her, nothing so simple as triumph. Something that had been waiting 7 years to finally have somewhere to go. Wexler didn't look at her as they walked him out in handcuffs, but he said one thing, low, almost conversational, as he passed within 10 feet of where she stood. Your mother was better at this than you'll ever be. I know, Ren said. That's exactly why I'm still standing here and you're the one in handcuffs. She didn't expect the last part. Nobody did. It was Faraday who saw her first, standing at the edge of the federal perimeter. An hour later, a woman stepping carefully out of an unmarked government vehicle, with dark hair gone silver at the temples, and a face that had aged 7 hard years in ways that photographs never quite captured. And Faraday's hand found Ren's shoulder and gripped it hard before she could even find the words. Ren. Ren turned, and the whole world went very quiet, very still, narrowed down to nothing but the space between herself and a woman she had buried in an empty casket at 20 years old. Mama. Margot Calloway's face broke open, 7 years of careful distance collapsing in an instant, and she crossed the last 20 feet, at something close to a run, and Ren met her halfway, and neither of them said anything else for a long time. There wasn't anything else that needed saying yet. There was just the fact of 2 heartbeats finally in the same place again, and the particular, wordless grief of 2 people who had each spent 7 years grieving a version of loss that had never actually been true. I am so sorry, Margot said finally, into her daughter's hair, voice breaking on every other word. I thought I was protecting you. I thought distance was the only shield big enough. You should have told me, Ren said, crying now, openly, the discipline, finally, mercifully, allowed to fall away. I needed you, Mama. Not a shield, you. I know that now, Margot said. I have known it every single day for 7 years and been too afraid to fix it. I am done being afraid, baby. I promise you that, I am done. They stood like that a long while, mother and daughter, while the federal agents finished their work behind them, and Faraday wept quietly, against her own hands 20 feet away. 7 years of stubborn, lonely faith finally rewarded. Tell me where you've been, Ren said, when she could finally speak again, pulling back just far enough to look at her mother's face, memorizing it the way she used to memorize range cards and ballistic tables, like a fact she needed her whole body to hold on to. All of it. I don't want the version you thought was safe to tell me. I want the truth. I will, Margot said. Every piece of it. I owe you 7 years of truth, and I intend to spend the rest of my life paying it back, one honest conversation at a time. Her hand came up to cradle Ren's face, thumb brushing away a tear that had already fallen, but not standing in a parking lot with federal agents 20 feet away, somewhere quieter, somewhere we can finally just be mother and daughter again, instead of 2 soldiers comparing notes on a mission. Deal, Ren said, and for the first time, in longer than she could remember, she laughed through the tears instead of past them, the sound surprising even her, small and rusty and entirely real, a laugh that had been waiting a very long time to be let back out into the open air. The county took most of a week to finish counting what the flood had cost it, and by the time the water fully receded from the low road, federal investigators had already begun unwinding 7 years of shell companies and buried maintenance flags stretching across 4 counties. Margot Calloway had mapped alone in the dark, one quiet, dangerous year at a time. Delaney was arrested within 48 hours, cooperating fast once he understood exactly how much evidence had survived him. Verlene Shaw would face her own reckoning in a courtroom, instead of a parking lot, and Ren, when asked whether she wanted to speak against her, had said only, quietly, that the truth deserved a witness more than revenge deserved an audience. The trial, when it finally came months later, was neither dramatic nor quick. Ren sat through 3 days of testimony beside her mother, hands folded, listening to prosecutors lay out 7 years of shell companies and buried maintenance flags in the flat, patient language of the law, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that watching justice move slowly felt better than any fast, private reckoning she might once have imagined for herself. There was no rifle scope in this ending, no ridge, no muzzle flash, no vanishing back into the tree line before anyone could say thank you, just a courtroom, and a record, and a system finally catching up to what one woman had tried, alone, 7 years too early, to make it see. Verlene did not go free. She also did not go unheard, and when she stood to speak at sentencing, voice shaking, eyes finding Ren's across the room, she said only that she hoped, someday, the daughter of the woman she'd betrayed might find it in herself to believe that love and failure could occupy the very same heart without canceling each other out. Ren did not answer her that day, but she did not look away either, and some part of her understood that not looking away was its own kind of answer, unfinished, honest, exactly as complicated as Nash had promised her it would be. Vance stood at the edge of the staging area the morning. Everyone finally began packing up, watching Ren and her mother stand together at the tailgate of a truck, heads bent close, talking in the low, unhurried cadence of 2 people who finally had all the time in the world to say everything they'd spent 7 years not saying. "You did good work here, Sergeant," Vance said to Nash, who'd come to stand beside her, both of them watching the last of the disaster. Equipment get loaded onto trucks, headed elsewhere. "We all did," Nash said. "Feels strange, though, ending a flood story with a reunion instead of a body count. Feels like exactly the ending this one earned," Vance said. She was quiet a moment, watching mother and daughter across the lot, and something in her own chest loosened, unexpected, the particular ache of a person who had spent a career learning to expect the worst from every disaster, and had just been handed, for once, something gentler than she'd braced for. "My mother used to say the whole point of showing up in the dark was so somebody, someday, got the chance to go home and tell their own mother about it," she said. "I don't think she ever imagined it working out quite this literally, but I like to think she'd have approved." "I think she would have," Nash said. "I think most mothers would." They stood together a while longer, watching the county slowly begin the long work of putting itself back together, and neither of them felt any particular need to fill the silence with anything more than that. Ren stayed in Larkspur Hollow another 2 weeks after the water finally went down, helping the guard finish what disaster relief work remained, standing beside her mother at a small, quiet gathering the county held for the families still rebuilding. No cameras, no speeches, just neighbors handing each other tools and casseroles, and the particular unglamorous grace of people getting back up together. On her last morning in the county, she stood with Margot at the edge of the river, the water calm now, ordinary, giving no sign at all of what it had carried through it only weeks before. A pair of herons worked the shallows nearby, unhurried, indifferent to the two women watching them, and somewhere behind them, a truck engine turned over, someone's rebuilt life quietly getting back on the road. What happens now? Ren asked. Now, Margot said, slipping her arm through her daughter's. We go home, together, and we let ourselves be exactly as unafraid as we've earned the right to be. Ren looked out at the water, calm, silver in the morning light, and felt something settle inside her that she hadn't felt in 7 long years. Not the absence of grief. Grief didn't work that way, she'd learned, and she no longer expected it to. Just the quiet, steady certainty of a woman who had finally stopped running, standing beside the mother she had never actually lost, exactly where she was always supposed to be, because there would be more work ahead of both of them. Faraday had already started drawing up plans for the next investigation, the counties still uncounted, the pattern that had begun long before Larkspur Hollow, and would not, realistically, end simply because one man sat now in a federal holding cell. Ren understood that. She had made her peace with it somewhere in the last 2 weeks, standing in the rebuilt kitchens of neighbors she'd never have met if the water hadn't risen the way it had. The fight her mother started was not finished. It might never be entirely finished, except finishing it alone, in secret, behind a wall of silence built out of love and fear in equal measure, was no longer the only shape the fight was allowed to take. We'll do it together, Margot said, as if she'd heard the whole thought pass behind her daughter's eyes. Whatever comes next, however long it takes. Together, Ren agreed, and for the first time since a chapel and a folded flag and an empty casket 7 years behind her, the word did not feel like something she was borrowing from a life she'd never actually been allowed to have. It felt, finally, like something that belonged to her.